Okay, we all know the caricature, right? The bald guy with the little glasses standing out in a thunderstorm flying a kite. But today we're diving into the actual multi-dimensional life of Benjamin Franklin. We're going to peel back those simplified grade school myths and look at a man who is constantly reinventing himself. His documented achievements, they literally blow the folklore out of the water. So let's get into it.
Here is our roadmap for today. We're looking at 4 key phases. First, we'll tackle the myth of the kite, then his era as a master of civic innovation. After that, we'll look at America's first diplomat, and finally, his abolitionist evolution.
All right, part 1, the myth of the kite. Let's separate the legend from the facts.
So did Benjamin Franklin discover electricity? I know a lot of us were taught that he did, but the short answer is no, he absolutely didn't. Electricity was actually a super well-known phenomenon by the mid-18th century. You had scientists and even parlor magicians across Europe generating static electricity and playing around with sparks for years. Franklin was really just part of this larger transatlantic community of thinkers who were debating how this energy actually worked in the natural world. He wasn't discovering it, he was trying to decode it.
The popular myth tells us he was struck by lightning, had this literal light bulb moment, and boom, electricity is discovered. But the reality is way more grounded and, honestly, way less dramatic. Franklin was trying to prove a very specific theory, that the lightning up in the storm clouds was the exact same stuff as the static electricity they were making in labs. To prove this, he wasn't trying to get struck, oh man, no way. He was actually just trying to catch the ambient electrical charge in the air. If lightning had directly struck that key, he would have been killed instantly. To put that in perspective, just a year later in 1753, a German scientist named Georg Wilhelm Reichmann actually died trying to replicate this kind of experiment when a ball of lightning jumped from his ungrounded equipment right into his head.
When it comes to the famous kite flight itself, it's wild how little primary evidence we actually have. It definitely didn't happen the way those majestic oil paintings show it. The details we do have mostly come from a 1752 letter Franklin wrote to his buddy in London, Peter Collinson, and a book published 15 years later by Joseph Priestley. We don't even have an exact date. Historians kind of guess it was around June 10, 1752, and they for sure weren't standing out in an open, windy field. Franklin and his son William were most likely huddled under a shed. Why? Well, to keep this silk string dry. Because if that string got soaked, the electrical current would have ground it out right through their bodies. Ultimately, his real scientific win here wasn't a magic trick with a kite. It was using these findings to invent the lightning rod, a super practical device that safely directed strikes into the ground, literally saving countless homes and ships from burning down.
Moving on to part 2, master of civic innovation. This is all about practical science for public utility.
You see, rather than just chasing abstract theories or hoarding patents to get rich quick, Franklin firmly believed that human intellect should serve the public good. He didn't just sit around writing lofty essays about improving the community, he rolled up his sleeves and literally built the civic foundations of Philadelphia. Back in the early 1700s, Philly was this rapidly growing city made mostly of wood, so fires were catastrophic. Franklin didn't just complain about the danger, he helped organize the Union Fire Company, the city's very first volunteer fire department. He also knew a functional society needed shared knowledge, so he spearheaded the Library Company of Philadelphia, which was the first public lending library in the colonies. He saw a desperate need for public health care, which led to the Pennsylvania Hospital, and he recognized the need for higher education, so he founded an academy that eventually became the University of Pennsylvania. His whole philosophy was, since we benefit from the inventions of others, we should freely share our own ingenuity.
Okay, check out this perfect symbol of his civic ingenuity and honestly his absolute genius for branding. It's his signature stamp, Be Free Franklin. As postmaster, he had the franking privilege, meaning he could send mail for free just by signing his name. But rather than just writing B. Franklin, he playfully turned his signature into a political statement and a stamp of efficiency. And get this, you can actually still get this exact cancellation mark stamped today if you visit a working post office partner site in historic Philadelphia. It's this awesome physical reminder of how he completely revolutionized colonial communications.
He literally spent decades overhauling an incredibly disjointed, messy postal system. He started out locally as the postmaster of Philadelphia in 1737, and he was so good at it that by 1757, he was bumped up to co-postmaster general for all the British colonies. And he wasn't a desk jockey. He personally rode on horseback for months inspecting these muddy, terrible colonial routes. He mandated new milestones, set up nighttime riders to speed up delivery, and forced everyone to keep rigorous books. In doing this, he basically built the nervous system that united the colonies. By 1775, he was serving as Postmaster General under the Continental Congress. That fast, reliable mail network, That became the very infrastructure that let revolutionary ideas, pamphlets, and battle plans spread fast enough to actually sustain a rebellion.
Let's shift gears to part 3, America's first diplomat. This is where we look at his incredible brand building in Paris.
So picture this. It's late 1776. Franklin arrives in Paris trying to secure desperately needed French support for the American Revolution. And he intentionally and brilliantly rebrands himself. He knew exactly what the French elite wanted to see. Now, the French court at Versailles was incredibly formal. We're talking drenched in silk, lace, powdered wigs, the whole shebang. But instead of trying to blend in, Franklin shows up in plain, unadorned clothes wearing a simple marten fur cap. He basically cosplayed as the natural, uncorrupted, New World Enlightenment sage that all the French philosophers had been obsessing over, and it sparked an absolute craze. It became known as the coiffure à la Franklin, with high society Parisian ladies actually styling their hair to look like his fur hat. He let his face be plastered on medallions, snuff boxes, rings, you name it. He turned himself into a massive celebrity, charming the highest levels of French society to win their hearts, and more importantly, their massive financial backing for the war.
But that calculated charm offensive, that was just laying the groundwork for some incredibly brutal diplomatic negotiations alongside John Adams and John Jay. Once Franklin nailed down the formal French alliance and their military support in 1778, which was heavily aided by the American win at Saratoga, by the way, he immediately pivoted to playing absolute hardball with Great Britain. He flat out refused to even entertain any informal peace deals that would keep America tied to the British Empire. During the actual treaty negotiations, he pulled off this incredibly delicate balancing act, refusing to make a separate peace behind France's back, honoring that alliance, while simultaneously squeezing the British for maximum American advantage. Ultimately, he demanded and got full, unequivocal British recognition of American independence to finalize the Treaty of Paris in 1783. He quite literally drew the map of the new nation. I think the sheer magnitude of his diplomatic triumph is best summed up by Thomas Jefferson. When Jefferson, who was obviously a political giant himself, arrived in Paris in 1785 to take over the post, the French foreign minister asked if he was there to replace Franklin. Jefferson just replied, "No one can replace him, sir. I am only his successor." Jefferson completely understood that when it came to international statecraft and public relations, Franklin was just in a league of his own.
Finally, let's look at part 4, the abolitionist evolution. This is his journey of profound moral growth.
History isn't always comfortable, right? And Franklin's life shows us the really complex arc of a man who started out holding the deep, pervasive prejudices of his time, but who actually allowed new evidence to change his mind. Early on, around 1735, Franklin was a slave owner. He held enslaved people in his own house, and he actively profited from printing runaway bounties and sale ads in his newspaper, the Pennsylvania Gazette. That was the reality of his early adulthood. But as he got older, we see this massive, documented shift in his moral compass. It eventually led to him becoming the president of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society in 1787 and making a forceful public push to end the slave trade entirely.
So what caused this massive 180 in his thinking? Well, a major turning point happened in 1758. A philanthropic friend brought him to visit one of Dr. Bray's schools for black children in Philadelphia, and it completely shattered his unquestioned assumptions about racial hierarchy. He spent time observing these students, and by 1763, he wrote that any perceived ignorance wasn't biological or natural at all. He realized it was entirely the result of a deliberate lack of education and the horrific, oppressive environment of slavery itself. He saw firsthand that African children had the exact same inherent capacity to learn and reason as white children. For a guy completely devoted to reason and science, this empirical evidence demanded that he change his worldview. And he did.
Now, Franklin didn't just ask for freedom. He recognized the deep, systemic damage the institution of slavery had inflicted. In his November 1789 address to the public, he aggressively called slavery an atrocious debasement of human nature. But here's what makes his stance so incredibly forward-thinking for the 18th century. His society demanded way more than just emancipation. They were actively demanding resources for education, moral instruction, and real employment opportunities for freed slaves. He understood that true freedom wasn't just breaking chains. It meant taking real societal responsibility to help freed individuals integrate, support their families, and thrive as equal citizens.
In the end, his very last act of public service was an aggressive fight for human rights, bringing his whole life of civic duty full circle. On February 3, 1790, an 84-year-old Franklin, whose health was seriously failing, used his immense political weight to petition the newly formed First Congress to step up and definitively end the slave trade. He urged them to, quote, promote mercy and justice toward this distressed race. And the reaction? Explosive. He faced fierce, immediate backlash from pro-slavery congressmen who used the compromises in the brand new Constitution to completely table the issue until 1808. Franklin passed away just a month later on April 17, 1790. He obviously didn't live to see the end of slavery, but he intentionally spent the very last drops of his monumental political capital forcing the highest levels of government to confront its greatest moral failing.
Looking at the totality of his 84 years, going from a runaway apprentice printer to a groundbreaking scientist, a civic mastermind, a legendary global diplomat, and finally an ardent abolitionist, we see a mind that simply never stopped working, never stopped analyzing, and never stopped adjusting. If Benjamin Franklin's greatest invention was actually his ability to let new information and new empathy change his deepest convictions, it leaves us with a pretty powerful question. How often do we allow ourselves to truly evolve and change our minds the way Franklin did?